The clouds had been sitting on the Ardennes for weeks. Not the dramatic storm clouds of a storybook battle, but something worse. A low, gray, featureless overcast that settled in over Belgium and Luxembourg in December 1944 and refused to lift. Fog in the mornings, drizzle through the afternoons. The kind of winter sky that doesn't announce itself. It just closes everything down and stays closed. For the men on the ground, it meant mud and cold and the grinding misery of a winter campaign. For the commanders trying to run that campaign, it meant something more specific and more catastrophic. It meant the Allied air forces couldn't fly. And in December 1944, with the German Ardennes offensive tearing a hold in the Allied line and the Third Army being turned north at 90 degrees to plug it, the Allied air forces not being able to fly was very close to a strategic disaster. The air support that Patton's infantry needed, the close air support that could break up German armor concentrations, destroy supply columns, give American soldiers the one advantage that German soldiers in 1944 did not have, was sitting on airfields waiting for a sky that was not providing what airplanes required to be useful. Patton needed the weather to change. He needed it with the specific urgency of a man who understood that the equation he was operating inside had a variable he couldn't control, and that the variable was going to determine the outcome regardless of everything else he brought to bear. So he went to his chaplain. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Let me back up a second, because the thing that happened next requires a particular understanding of who George Patton was when it came to God, prayer, and the relationship between the two. Patton was a man of genuine and complicated faith. He had grown up in a household where religion was not ornamental, where the tradition of prayer before combat went back to the stories he had heard about his grandfather, Colonel George S. Patton, Sr., who died at the head of his regiment at the Third Battle of Winchester in 1864. Religion, for Patton, was woven into war the way the weather was woven into it, or logistics, or the quality of the enemy's officer corps. It was a variable, and Patton was a man who worked his variables. He was also a man who applied the same directness to his relationship with God that he applied to his relationships with everyone else. The accounts of his private prayers describe someone who spoke to God the way he spoke to a superior, with complete respect for the authority, and with a directness that did not bother with preamble when there was a point to make. He expected results from prayer the way he expected results from everything else in his command. When results were not forthcoming, he was not above saying so. What he had never done before December 1944 was commission a prayer. His chaplain was Colonel James H. O'Neill, a man who had spent his career in the demanding work of ministering to soldiers, presiding over the births and deaths and despairs and recoveries that accumulate in a wartime chaplain's life, providing the sacraments and the presence and the specific form of human accompaniment that the Army cannot provide through its other channels. He was experienced. He was steady. And he was not, as far as anyone who knew him was aware, accustomed to the kind of request Patton was about to make. Patton called him in. The account of what followed has been documented by O'Neill himself, who wrote about it afterward. Patton asked him, directly and without preamble, if he had a prayer for weather. O'Neill said he didn't believe there was one readily available. Patton said something to the effect that weather was a very important factor in military operations. He said he wanted a prayer, a good prayer, that would ask God for clear weather so that the Third Army could conduct its air operations and drive the Germans back. He gave O'Neill, according to the account, the clear impression that this was an order. Now, here's the thing. O'Neill later said that his first instinct was to question the theological propriety of the request. The tradition of prayer in warfare is ancient and complicated, but the idea of a specific operational prayer for meteorological conditions, commissioned by a general and distributed to 250,000 men, was not, as far as he knew, a precedent the Church had formally established. He was a chaplain. He was also a colonel. He went away and he wrote the prayer. What he produced was brief and direct, and asked, without embellishment, that the weather cooperate. It acknowledged the immoderate rains the army had been contending with, and requested that God, in his great goodness, grant fair weather for battle. It was, in its way, a document that reflected the spirit of the man who had commissioned it. No wasted words, specific in its request, addressed to the ultimate authority with the full expectation of being heard. Picture it. December 1944. A chaplain sitting down to write a prayer for weather on behalf of an army of 250,000 men, commissioned by a general who expected results. The prayer written. The prayer reviewed. Then, and this is the part that requires a second look, the prayer printed and distributed to every man in the Third Army. Not quietly, not privately. Approximately 250,000 cards, carrying the prayer on one side and a Christmas greeting from Patton to his men on the other. Soldiers in foxholes in Belgium and Luxembourg received this card. They put it in their pockets. Some of them read it. Some of them, in the specific extremity of December 1944 in the Ardennes, said it. Here's what doesn't make it into the history books: the specific quality of what it meant to distribute a prayer for weather to 250,000 men in combat. Patton had not done this because he was performing piety. He was not a performer. He had done it because he understood, in the operational way he understood everything, that the men in those foxholes needed something to do with the thing they were doing. The prayer gave the weather a name. It put the weather into a frame that included the possibility of change. It told the men that the commanding general of the Third Army had gone to the highest available authority and filed the appropriate request, and that the request was reasonable and was expected to be honored. In the logic of a man like Patton, this was not theater. It was chain of command. And this is where it gets complicated. The weather broke on December 23, 1944, after more than a week of overcast, fog, and the December misery that had grounded the Allied air forces and slowed the drive toward Bastogne. The sky over the Ardennes cleared. Not partially, completely. Clear, cold blue sky, flying weather, bombing weather, the kind of sky that the Third Army's infantry have been waiting for with the desperation of men who know that what's coming at them has armor and they do not have air support. The aircraft went up. On December 23rd and the days that followed, Allied air power was applied to the German offensive in the way it had not been able to be applied for more than a week. The skies that had been protecting German supply columns and armor concentrations were suddenly full of American and British aircraft. The operational calculation began to change. The tide of the Battle of the Bulge began to turn. Patton called O'Neill. "Stay with me, because what Patton said to his chaplain when he called is the part that doesn't fit the version of this story where Patton is simply being Patton. By the accounts of those present, he was not sardonic about it. He was not ironic. He told O'Neill, in the direct way that he told people things, that the prayer had worked. He said this the way you state a fact. The sky was clear. The prayer had requested clear sky. The sky was clear. Then he awarded Colonel James H. O'Neill the Bronze Star. Think about that for a second. The Bronze Star. Not for battlefield valor, but for the prayer. For having written, under commission, a document addressed to God requesting specific meteorological cooperation in the conduct of a military campaign, and for the prayer having achieved its stated objective. The medal recognized the result. Patton was not a man who awarded medals for effort. He awarded them for outcomes. See, what most folks don't realize is that there are two completely different ways to read this story, and both readings are simultaneously available. In the first reading, Patton was a man of genuine faith, who understood that prayer was real, that weather was within the province of divine authority, and that asking God's cooperation in a righteous war was exactly what a soldier should do. In this reading, the medal is serious. It honors the chaplain who had the theological wherewithal to write the petition, and the faith to present it properly, and the December 23rd sky is taken at face value as what it appeared to be. A prayer was made. The sky was answered. In the second reading, Patton was a man who treated the divine the way he treated everything in his operational environment, as a resource to be managed. He needed weather. He went to the available authority. He commissioned the appropriate document and distributed it through proper channels. When the weather changed, as weather always eventually changes, he credited the request and rewarded the requester. In this reading, the medal is characteristic, Patton honoring what worked, regardless of what it was. The problem with the second reading is that Patton himself doesn't seem to have believed it. The accounts of his private faith suggest a man who took prayer seriously, who had spoken to God in personal terms throughout the war, who believed that the Allied side of the conflict was the side God had chosen, and who stated this belief directly and repeatedly to the people around him. Patton's theology was operational, but it was not cynical. Colonel James H. O'Neill, chaplain to the Third Army. The man who had never written a prayer for weather before December 1944, and who did so under what he described as a very clear understanding that this was expected of him. He spent the rest of his life being asked about that prayer. He answered the questions with the consistency of a man whose account of the facts was not in dispute, and whose interpretation of them remained what it had always been. He had done what was asked of him, the weather had cleared, and those were two facts that sat next to each other in the historical record, in whatever relationship they sat in. He wore the Bronze Star. He kept the prayer. He answered the questions. On December 23, 1944, the sky over the Ardennes cleared. The men in the foxholes had the prayer cards in their pockets. The aircraft went up. The course of the battle began to change. Whether the two facts belong in the same sentence is a question that December 1944 posed and left open. The weather broke. The Third Army moved. The sky was clear. Was Patton right to commission a prayer as an operational document, to treat the Almighty as a resource to be contacted through proper channels and rewarded with a decoration when the results came in? Some would say this was a reduction of faith to utility, a general's hubris dressed in the language of supplication, the kind of certainty about God's interest in one army's weather that should make a believer uncomfortable. Others would say exactly the opposite, that there is nothing unserious about a soldier in extremity asking God for what he needs, that the prayer was genuine regardless of the circumstances of its commission, and that awarding a medal for a result is only surprising if you didn't believe the result was coming. That Patton believed it, that the sky said he was right. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.